Hello, all, and welcome to Chapter 1 for Introduction to Agricultural Economics. So we're just going to go through the PowerPoint this week like we'll do every week throughout this semester, hitting some of the high points. As always, feel free to contact me via email or text message or even phone call, all of those to my cell phone that's in the syllabus. If you have any questions or need any clarification, doing PowerPoints isn't an ideal setting to open up a whiteboard or anything and start drawing. So if you have detailed technical questions, it's much better to handle that by asking questions either in the class forum on Canvas or via any of the other methods I just mentioned. So we're going to kind of move forward and we'll skip past some of these learning objectives. Not a big deal, but what we're trying to do is kind of hit the high points. So just as an overview, some of this might be repetitive from the opening class video, but in this class, we're going to focus primarily on microeconomics and its application to agricultural economics. But it will be helpful to understand some of what macroeconomists do. And most of that material is going to be in this chapter. So we're going to talk about what economics is, what agricultural economics is in particular, and then the fields of microeconomics, macroeconomics. We'll discuss some different ways of analyzing economic policies, and then we'll look at how we measure economic performance. We're also going to look at the types of structures of economies that can exist towards the end of this particular chapter. So let's just move right on forward. So first off, economics really at its core, when you see the definition later on in this PowerPoint, is about how agents, and when we're talking about agents, we're talking about businesses, households, or individuals, or even government actors, right? So individual agents or collections of agents, but how agents make decisions at the margin, and we'll clarify what that means about at the margin, over the allocation of scarce resources given unlimited ones, right? This is a pretty good working definition of economics. Most definitions of economics are on board with this with slight modification. There's another definition I like from a different author, and that is that economics is the study of the production and resource allocation and consumption and distribution of goods and services throughout the economy in a sustainable fashion, right? And that can be helpful to think of as well. But either way, one of the key attributes of economics is that there is scarcity. In fact, I might argue that without scarcity, it's hard to believe that we need to study economics, right? Economics is how we make decisions over scarce resources. If nothing's scarce, you can have whatever you want. I want you to think about that, right? What's the role of a budget if everything's free or if everything can just be picked up, right? Do you need to have a budget? Do you need to have any real accounting structure? Do you worry about controlling for costs or controlling for anything in an environment without scarcity? So economics starts from the presumption that all items in the economy are scarce, right? Now, scarcity is a fundamental component of what we're talking about with these items, right? Scarce, meaning limited supply. Everything we can think of, eventually we run out of. So if we're looking at natural and biological resources, eventually we run out of land that's usable. Eventually we run out of mineral deposits. We will run out of oil. We will run out of helium. We would run out of argon. We'd run out of nitrogen. Everything eventually hits a limit, right? Just some things are more scarce than others. So scarcity, once again, fundamental. It's the basis of what items are, right? Anything you can buy, sell, or trade, I would argue is scarce. If you think there's things that you can buy, sell, and trade that aren't scarce, feel free to email them to me. And maybe we'll use that as a discussion question for this chapter, which is, what can you think of that isn't scarce? What would make it not scarce? Now, there's a difference between scarcity and shortage. Shortage is something that is related not to the fundamental idea of what the item is, right? Not everything is in a shortage. Shortage is relative to regional or temporal locational issues, right? So we might have a shortage of a particular product over a particular time, but we know eventually it's going to come back in stock. Since COVID, we can think of a lot of things that have been in short supply in the last few years, right? So we could think of infant formula, we could think of some pharmaceuticals, we can think of almost anything that you needed shipped across an ocean for over a year there was in short supply. Now, all of those items were already scarce, but there's shortage because normally we wouldn't have a problem finding those things. But because we do right now, there's a shortage of them, right? And we know that that shortage will be rectified with more production, better distribution frameworks, things like that. So when we're looking at scarce resources, we can talk about those natural and biological resources. We can talk about human resources. There's a limited number of workers, and there's a limited number of skilled workers within that as a subset of workers. And then we can talk about manufactured resources or capital goods. So machinery, equipment, structures, all those things are in short supply. So when we have scarcity, we need to make choices, right? So if, as I said before, if there was no scarcity, we could have our cake and eat it too, right? Which is a kind of a saying that has a lot of economic application. It's very hard to do that, right? Because of scarcity. As a consumer, I need to choose what I want. If you think in your life, what's the two things that are most scarce? It's probably money and time, right? And both of those kind of go hand in hand at the end of the day, because a lot of your ability to make money is based on your time, at least if you're a worker bee, right? And so, but sometimes the amount of money you can make is limited by the amount of money you have as well, right? So, but because we have these kind of scarce resources, we have to make choices. As a producer, you also have to look at scarcity and make a choice as well. If you're a farmer in the upper Midwest and you're looking at producing corn or wheat, or even soybean, there's a trade-off. Most of the land in certain parts of this country can be used for any of those three goods or other goods as well. And so you look at what you perceive to be the most scarce thing in the coming planning cycle, and your job is to try to figure out what can you chase that's going to make you money and make you more than other people. And all the other farmers and all of the other producers are making those similar decisions as well. And then they're also doing it in a global sense as well. And then you're playing the odds against weather as well. So there's a lot of factors in terms of making choices. Just because we can use economics to study our choices doesn't mean that we'll develop ever the full set of constraints over which we're making choices, so that we can know that we're truly making the best choice, but we can make the best choice with the knowledge that we have today. Another concept from economics is opportunity costs. Opportunity costs are the explicit and the implicit. The book says implicit, but I like to use both. All of the costs associated with an economic decision. Every decision we make has an opportunity cost. So you can choose to watch this lecture, or you can choose not to watch the lecture. We're going to assume you're in group 1 since you're hearing this. If you're in group 2, you'll never hear this, right? And so you make a choice given your limited time over what you're going to allocate in order to learn the material for this course. And maybe you decide to use this lecture material, maybe you don't. Maybe you sit through this and you say, not worth it for the future. I'm going to focus my time on other aspects. But the cost of watching this lecture is what you gave up to do it. That cost varies for all of you. Some of you, it might have been sleep, might have been leisure time, or it might have been not going to work and making money, right? And so we can quantify those costs to the extent that they cost you money. But sometimes these are intangible costs. We can't actually quantify it. Specialization is the concept of people specializing in what they're best at. I like to think about this in terms of household production models. So if you have a household with, let's use a traditional family with 2 parents and children. And so you have one parent that can, let's be a little non-PC. We're going to assume this is a historic family in the 1950s, and we're going to make this a very gendered conversation in this respect. Doesn't have to be, but just kind of to illustrate the point. I think all of you have seen TV shows or movies from the 50s and 60s with a very rigid sociological idea of what the family is, right? So you're going to have a family with a mother, with a father, with, let's say, the prototypical 3 children from the 1950s. I think back then it was actually 4, but we'll go with 3 kids. And so in this household, everyone could have a free-for-all and just do whatever work they see needs to be done. And it might or might not get done. There might be some gaps, right? But let's just say that we're going to divvy up the work. And I'll use my life as an example because my wife and I are pretty uh, old-fashioned in some respects, right? In terms of our division of labor, although we differ in others. And so, kind of social comedic import or some comedic levity on this topic. So in our life, I have some allergies related to uh, outside, right? In terms of grasses or in terms of especially nuts and nut pollens, and being where we are in the Central Valley, probably not a great allergy to have when you're allergic to like walnut and almond pollen from the trees. I'm not allergic to the nuts, just to the tree pollen. And so my wife, she actually enjoys working outside. She enjoys working on the yard. So my wife enjoys doing this. And so my wife mows the lawn, she edges, she does the weed whacking. She'll do all of those activities for the most part, her and the kids. And she's doing it because she specializes in it. If I do those activities, I actually take longer than her because I have to mask up. I have to take a shower afterwards. Otherwise, my eyes are burning and I'm itching. I'll have problems breathing depending on the particular what's going on in my grass that day. I have an ugly lawn, so it doesn't look that pretty. But my wife focuses on what she's better at, and that frees me up to do other activities. So I'm much more likely to be doing the dishes or making food than my wife is. No, not always, but that's the way we are right now. When it comes to the cars, my wife doesn't know very much about cars, so I tend to take care of the cars by either going to the dealer or doing the work myself. So I'm the one who will do the brake job. I'll do oil changes, or I'll pay someone to do it. And that's something that I focus on because I'm good at it, right? And then when we look at doing projects like doing clothes, that's something where all of us can do it because none of us have a comparative advantage. I don't like doing laundry. My wife doesn't like it. My kids don't like it. So what we've decided is everyone does their own thing, right? So there are things that you are good at within your own household production. And there are things that other people are good at within your household. And and that could be related to things that you like or just things, sometimes we're good at things we don't like doing. I'll give you an example. I don't really like cleaning bathrooms, but for whatever reason, I'm actually pretty freaking good at it. I had a job a while back doing janitorial work when I was in high school for a summer camp. One of the rotations I went through while I worked there, and I got taught how to clean a bathroom, and I don't find it to be a difficult task. As I said, don't enjoy it, but I'm pretty freaking good at it. I can do it quick and I can make it clean. And so when you're looking at doing things, you should focus in what you can specialize in, what you have a comparative advantage for. And sometimes that comparative advantage is based upon intangibles or things that just happen. And sometimes they're based upon specialized training and skills, right? So maybe you have more knowledge about how to do something than someone else, and therefore you would do it more effectively and more quickly. But the goal in specialization is to look at the advantages that a party has and use that as the basis for trade determination. And we'll get into some examples. Then we have individual decisions, the maximization of consumer utility and producer profits. And then societal decisions. And these are based, we're going to use a model called production possibilities frontiers to evaluate how societies make decisions about allocating goods and services. So opportunity cost, the implicit cost associated with the next best. So it's not associated with what you do. It's your second best choice, right? So we say, what's the opportunity cost associated with pursuing a degree at Texas A&M University? So the opportunity cost is what would have been your next best decision. So let's say that instead of Texas A&M, you got into University of Colorado, right? And Boulder. And so you could have gone there. So the cost associated with going Texas A&M is that you now no longer have the time or resources to go to a different campus, right? That's one way of thinking about this. And, what I like to say normally is the problem with opportunity cost is that it's really good at evaluating financial decisions, Like if I buy this stock, what else could I have bought that would have been better? But it can be challenging because some of the most important decisions in life, you have ill-defined cost structures for what your alternatives are, right? So this is a very unromantic example, but I met my wife and we got married 26, 27 years ago now. When we met, my opportunity cost of marrying her were all the other persons that I could have gotten with and gotten married to or cohabitated with. Now, how do I know? Don't no one tell my wife I said this, but how do I know I made the best decision? Now, as economists, we assume the decision you made was the best decision because we assume people are profit maximizing, self-motivated individuals, right? In profit, we're going to not just talk financially, but just in general, happiness maximizing, whatever. So you maximize your choices. So we assume that the choice you made was the best one for you, given the information you had at time. But what happens if I would have waited 6 months and maybe met someone else who was better than her for me? Or whatnot? As I said, some of the most important decisions in life, we don't know what the actual costs are associated with our true decision. Let's say you graduate from college. You have 2 job offers, both of the companies very similar. The pay structure is the same. You've researched them both. You can't tell any real difference between the jobs. Same title, same job duties, same everything. How do you know which is the company to go with until you make the decision? Once you make the decision, you might have made a decision. You end up somewhere and you go, man, this boss is a real a-hole. I don't like him. Now what do you do, right? So opportunity cost is a great idea, but it can be very challenging to say, oh, well, here are all of the costs associated with that decision, right? When we get to the farming and ag space, you have a choice as a farmer between crops, right? Unless you're using a long range crop or you're involved in livestock production, then you become there are a lot of fixed costs associated with those items, right? And sunk costs. So once you've made that decision to go down the road of planting trees or running a livestock operation, it can be challenging to change. But if you're a crop producer and you're producing row crop, most of the equipment's fungible, right? I can use my combines and tractors for any type of equipment. Some of it's set up for row spacing and things like that. But at the end of the day, I've got a lot of opportunities. So if you're a normal farmer, you're choosing based on your weather patterns and where you're located and what works good for you between corn and soybean, sometimes corn, soybean, and wheat. And if you're looking at corn and soybean, you can make the decision to produce corn. How can you know what the true cost of not producing corn would have been? You won't know till after the fact, right? You won't know if the weather would have been more favorable if you had made a different choice for you until after that weather occurs. And so, as I said, opportunity cost is a great teaching concept, sometimes hard to put into pragmatic reality and practice. In fact, it's hard to use for decision making, right? It's a great ex post. Something already happened. Now let me evaluate the opportunity cost of what I did. But until you did it, you might not have had a full idea of the costs. So here's an example we have for different types of crop production. So we've got a farmer. They can choose to grow cotton, and they're going to get 500-pound acre yield. They'll get 96 cents a pound, and the production expenses are going to be $285 an acre. Option 2, I'll let you read down the numbers on that. Option 3, you're just going to lease, receive 200 an acre, costs you 40 an acre to maintain. So the question is, which one should you choose? These are all of your options. Your opportunity cost is actually the second best option from what you choose. So let's evaluate and decide, what do you choose? And then what was your second best? So we're going to use profit because this is an economic example, and profit is just revenue minus costs. And we've got an example of how to calculate that revenue because all of our production, we've got our expenses are just the expenses, the dollar amount divided by the acre or per acre, right? But in terms of revenue, we need to take that it's the price times the yield, right? And so that's how we're going to make this decision. And so here's the math on that. So option 1, our revenue is 96 cents a pound. we get 500 pounds. That means we get $480 an acre. So our costs are going to be $285 an acre. Our profit is going to be revenue minus the cost. And so we're going to take that revenue 480 minus 285, and we get 195 an acre. Option 2, our profit ends up being 152.50 an acre, and option 3 is 160. So obviously we're going to choose the item that gives us the most profit, right? And so in this example, option 1 was to grow cotton, right? So we're going to grow that cotton. So our opportunity cost, what we gave up to grow cotton, was the second best. So which one's our second best? It's the one that would have earned us the next amount of money, which is option 3, to do the leasing. And then our opportunity cost of option 2 would have been 152.50. And so one way of thinking about it, though, is once again, it's the amount we gave up. So I like to think about it as the difference between 195 and 152.50, or 195 and 160. So, you know, if I chosen that, I would have given up. If I would have chosen option 3 over option 1, I would have given up $35 an acre, right? Just one way of looking at it. So moving on from opportunity cost, we look at the issue of specialization and being able to specialize in the production of a good or a service. So definition, the separation of production activities between persons or geographic areas in such a manner that none of these persons or regions is completely self-sufficient. There are examples of specializations for regions of the US. The original definition of specialization is given out a long time ago in Adam Smith's Wealth, Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, right? Sometimes just abbreviated as Wealth of Nations. And in his book, and he might not be the first example, but first widely acknowledged example in economics, he uses the example of a family that produces pins. And by pins, that's P-I-N, like pins and needles. And so the idea is that this family produces pins in a household production manner, and they could each sit there, all members of the household, and they could just sit there with all the materials and the supplies, and they could each make their own thing. But if we think about them all making pins together at the same time, then what we're really talking about is you're going to need to have a lot more resources. Each person is going to need the cutting shears to cut the metal. Each person's going to need their own hammer. There's going to be more materials needed. And so this idea extends into the production line with Taylor and Ford, right? And so there's this idea of Taylorism or scientific management, or Ford with the factory line. And so the idea is, well, if you have a factory line setting for this family where each person specializes in an act of production, then they're not going to need as many tools to get the job done. And they'll be able to produce more tools with less resources. Or sorry, more pins with less tools or less resources, right? So they'll still need the steel for all of the pins, but they won't need as many tools. They won't need as much capital equipment. And the idea behind building cars or anything on a factory line is the idea that you can do more with less. Even in the modern sense, when we look at doing production of intellectual property goods like software, we found that in programming environments, right, coders will use object-oriented programming so that they can compartmentalize code, and you can have lots of people working on the same task. In agricultural production, we have lots of different methods of specialization, and some of it can, in a modern world, get very highly technical, right? And so some growers develop more and more specialized methods of production, right? So we can talk about specialization at different levels and different values. So in this example, we're going to look at the relative strengths of 3 different states in the production of different goods. So we have Kansas. They grow a surplus of wheat, a shortage of potatoes, and a shortage of oranges. Idaho, they have lots of potatoes, less wheat, less oranges. And Florida, they'll have all of the oranges, let's be honest, because what were our other two? Idaho and, let's do this. Idaho and Kansas are not producing oranges in any great quantity. We can argue that Kansas will definitely dominate in wheat production. Idaho is going to get a little wheat production, but they'll dominate in potatoes, right? And so if we put all of these together, and we could make this more and more complex, but what we see is that Kansas, they all three have surpluses in different things, right? So Kansas has a surplus of wheat, Idaho potatoes, and Florida's surpluses in oranges. And the concept of specialization in trade is that if every state specializes in what they do best, they can use the product they make the most of to trade for other products that they don't make as well, right? Now, this is the pure example where each state has an absolute advantage in production of something. But what I want you to know is that even if all of these states didn't have an absolute advantage, maybe one of the states still didn't have a surplus of anything, they still would be better relatively at producing one thing than another state. And later in the semester, towards the end of the semester, we might get into the chapter on gains of trade and comparative advantage, and we can go through the math on that. But until we do the math on it, you'll just have to trust me that even if you are having an absolute advantage in the production of anything, you're still going to be able to find something that you're comparatively better at than someone who has the absolute advantage in production of everything. So an example of that is the US absolutely produces more in a lot of agricultural goods. We still trade with other countries that do less absolutely in production than we do, just because we have other things that we can make that are higher value crops, right? So one way of thinking about this is we don't have to grow almonds. The reason we use ag land in California for almonds is because we have a comparative advantage where we can make that relatively better than other places can, right? And we give up less of other items to make those items. But as I said, the math for that can wait till later in the semester. If you're interested, you can just jump ahead. I think that's in chapter 17, right? So you could go kind of see the math and see where we're heading there. So every state specializes. That means Florida is going to trade oranges for wheat from Kansas, and they'll send oranges to Idaho to get some of their potatoes, and they'll also leave some oranges for themselves and their own population, right? Idaho, once again, going to send that potato back. So the scope of economics, we have microeconomics and macroeconomics. When Adam Smith in 1776 wrote The Wealth of Nations, Inquiry into Nature Causes Wealth of Nations, and later economists came along and were writing on economics, like David Ricardo in particular, or even some of you might have heard Karl Marx writing on economics even later. The world hadn't been divided into micro and macroeconomics. That division really didn't occur until the 1900s, right? So initially economics was economics. And what you'd find is that most economics was being presented in micro terms and then applied to macro. Then we started talking during the Great Depression, really, about macroeconomics and studying the macroeconomy. And then fast forward to the 1970s and 80s, we've kind of reverted back to a world, at least at the graduate level, not the undergraduate level, but at graduate level, where we still have micro and macroeconomics, but what we do is we have micro models starting in the 80s and 90s as the foundation of our macro models, right? And so we use individual agent models to build up a macro economy. But that's a little more advanced, but that's just kind of the history of where economics has been. So microeconomics focuses on individuals or groups of individuals. So we're looking at households, firms, farms, and then you and I. And then also a lot of times the state or government as an entity. In macroeconomics, we're not looking at how individuals or groups of individuals make decisions. We're looking at the results of all of those interactions at the aggregate economic level. And so when we talk about macroeconomics, we're really talking about GDP, unemployment, and inflation, things like those terms. We have the fallacy of composition. That which is true in an individual situation is not necessarily true in the aggregate. This is one of those things we know and has always presented a problem for economics, especially notice what I was saying in modern economics, we have these micro models that lead to the foundation of the macroeconomy. We also know that sometimes if we scale up, it doesn't scale up the same way. And that's because of a mathematical concept called superadditivity. What that means is the pie that you can build together is bigger than the pie you can build by yourself. So I want you to think of kind of a Robinson Crusoe, right? You're abandoned on an island, right? This is an old story. And so you get abandoned on an island and you're all by yourself. You could get pretty far, But how many of you think you'd get further by having at least another person with you? How many think you'd get even more growth by having even more people together? And so the idea is that because we have a society, we have more than we would have had on our own individually, not working together, right? We get more from the group than we get from the sum of all of us doing our own thing. One way of thinking about this is historically, you could have had a community where you had 50 small farms. Each farm produces all the food they need for themselves and then tries to produce surplus so that they can sell to others in the community. If you look at that community 50 years later, do you expect that community to be more wealthy, or the community where every farmer decides, either gets together through planning or organically makes individual decisions where they don't try to produce everything for themselves, they try to specialize? And so you have one farmer growing more corn, another growing more soy, another growing cotton, someone growing oats, maybe someone growing more of your boutique crops, tomatoes, melons, cantaloupes, things like that. Is what it is. You also have some ranchers doing different meat specializations. So instead of one farmer trying to have cattle and have poultry and have hogs, you have a farmer that just does cattle, one that does hogs, and one that does poultry, right? What community do you think will have more output in the aggregate? The community where everyone tries to do their own thing and make a little on top, or the community where everyone focuses on what they're relatively good at and makes more of that and trusts other people to make the other things that they need in life? What we've seen from history is that communities that work together in that second model have greater economic output than the communities where they isolate and focus only on themselves. So we have two different ways of looking at the economic world. We have what's called positive versus normative economic analysis. The idea behind positive, sometimes economists historically would call this scientific, right? But positive is what is or what would happen if. Normative is what should be. So the way I like to think about it is positive is just a statement about the world and the way it is, or the way it should be based upon our causal models. Normative is philosophically or religiously what should be, right? So how should we produce to maximize production in the economy, as opposed to how much do we actually produce? Then we have our alternative economic systems. We've got capitalism, socialism, communism, and then we've got the US and most countries, which are a mixture of those systems in the modern world. Okay, so I'll let you read this CAPS commentary on your own. As you're reading, I just want you to kind of focus on the fact that the author of this book and the author in general is fairly pro-capitalism, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, what you'll find in the semester is I'm fairly pro-capitalism as well. But I want you to understand that there are different ways of analyzing the economy and analyzing the world, right? It isn't just one way. And so I want you to focus on the fact that there could be another way. And so the CAPS commentary gets into the wealth of nations and talks about Adam Smith's concept of the invisible hand. Now, I've read The Wealth of Nations. It's actually in 3/4 volumes, depends on how it was produced. But it's a 3-volume work. And it's fairly lengthy. And in that, what you'll find is that even Adam Smith himself reserves that some things don't get produced well through an invisible hand, right? There are certain things that matter. He would argue health, for example, doesn't oftentimes get translated well into economic activity, right? And so the idea of the free market that comes out of Adam Smith might be hyper idealized by some individuals and go beyond what Adam Smith himself even proposed. And there's nothing wrong with that or right with that. I just want you to understand the difference, right? In the way that different people think about the world. So the one thing that we do know is that people operate off of incentives, and incentives are important, but we need to remember that incentives for different people can mean different things, right? Not everyone is motivated by financial gain or loss. Economists assume that, but that is not necessarily the case. I get into this with my wife. She runs a small business in healthcare, and she does a lot of her work on the basis of what's good for her people and how to help her people. And she does a lot of work, I would argue, for free, because her focus isn't really on making money. It's on serving the community and doing more for the people around her, right? And so if that's your focus, you're going to have different methods of evaluating. Your incentives will be different, right? Part of my research when I was younger was looking at Israeli agricultural collectives called kibbutzim. They were organized on socialist constructs in the late 1800s, early 1900s, all the way up through to modern time period. There's still socialist collectives in Israel in these terms of these kibbutz, or the kibbutzim plural. And so what I analyzed in these early kibbutzim from the 1930s and 40s that were organized still on socialist principles was that most of them weren't motivated or incentivized by income, by profit. What they were incentivized by was a concept called bread labor, the idea of how hard people work. And so the value, the people who were revered in that society, in these agricultural collectives, were the people who worked the hardest. And so what that meant is as people aged and ended up going into the governance and the administration of the collective, they actually lost value in society, and the young people who could work hard on the land had more value, right? And so the reason I'm telling you that is because you can organize in other ways and still get positive outcomes. This is just one method of organization. And there's also other more nuanced methods of looking at economic structure and organization that this book doesn't really get into. But when we look at it, we could talk about something called market-based socialism. And so there's been quite a bit of research historically done on this. We don't have a lot of examples except for the modern time period of China, really, where we can say, look, the government can use market incentives to produce socialist outcomes. We don't tend to think about it in the US because we don't do it this way, but the world is larger than us and there are more ideas. And a little interesting sideline is that Karl Marx himself would have said that capitalism is a necessary step on the way to get to socialism. So Marx himself didn't view it as a choice between capitalism or socialism as organization. He actually believed that capitalism eventually produces all the gains it can, and things fall apart, and socialism is what comes in afterwards as the next linear transition of an economy that's developed. In the real world, that's not how it happened. In the real world, we had a feudal country called Russia, and the czars, they got overthrown, but let's hope my history's right, the Bolsheviks, but I could be wrong there. It's been a while. But anyway, you have these czars getting thrown out, and Lenin and the Marxists come in, and they take a country that was fairly feudal with peasants and serfs and lords, and they turned it into a country that is socialist. At least that was their goal. And Karl Marx probably would have rolled over his grave and said, hey, you lost all the benefits of capitalism, right? It's very clear in Karl Marx's work that he wanted that capitalism was going to propel people forward, right, to get to that point. We do have this interesting diatribe on the inequality and the distribution of wealth. There's a guy, Corrado Gini, who developed the concept called Gini coefficient, and it's a way of measuring equality in a society. And what you'll notice from that is the US has risen in inequality, but it's a very small change. And we're still basically a 50-50 society. We're still more equal than we are unequal, but is what it is. There are countries that are much more unequal than the United States, and countries that are more equal, neither good or bad. We've got an idea about inequalities in the distribution of wealth. One of the arguments here is that because people see people with wealth, it motivates them to work harder. There's another concept, though, that stands in contrast to that, which is if people see too much of a wealth gap, it can lead to depression and isolation where they say, look, there's no way I'm ever catching up, so why try, right? And so we don't know how people will respond, but we do know that inequality can produce the motivation for people to try to do better, right? But, at least in an economic sense. We could also look, though, if we're looking at unequal distribution of wealth, and your method of wealth is an Israeli kibbutzist, where you're saying, look, my ability to produce and work hard is my wealth. Well, the older you get, the less the distribution of wealth is equal, right? It's equal amongst young, healthy people who aren't disabled. It becomes unequal later on. So Winston Churchill great saying, the inherent vice of capitalism is the unequal sharing of blessings. The inherent virtue of socialism is the equal sharing of miseries. He's not the first or last intelligent person who's basically identified that there's good and bads to everything. There's a Nobel Prize winning economist from India named Amartya Sen who's looked extensively at democracies and socialist structures and also dictatorships. And what he said is basically there's strengths and weaknesses to all of these systems. Amartya Sen definitely would find himself in the capitalist branch, but he said, look, there's problems that capitalism isn't well suited to address, just as there's problems that socialism can't address very well either. He gives an example of famine versus chronic malnutrition and starvation, right? And his argument is capitalism can structure itself and democracies can structure themselves around addressing an acute problem that just comes up like a famine very well. But socialism might be better addressing long-term starvation and malnutrition. And he uses examples of India and China to make his case. So, but that's just one example. So anyway. Okay, you guys can read this on your own, just another commentary. So definition of economics for this textbook, a social science that deals with how consumers, producers, and societies choose among the alternative uses of scarce resources in the process of producing, exchanging, and consuming goods and services. So that's the definition you're responsible for. And then we've got our agricultural economics definition. It's an applied social science that deals with how producers, consumers, and societies use scarce resources in the production and processing, marketing, and consumption of food and fiber products. So that's your definition. So what do agricultural economists do? I said this before, but their main role is to look at the world through the microeconomic level. They look at production, they look at marketing, they look at the financial, and they look at resources. There's also a role for agricultural economists in the macro level, especially in relation to exchange rates, but also inflation rates play a hand in how much agricultural prices are done. In this class, we're mainly focused on those microeconomic levels, and we're not going to get too into the macro analysis at all. And then economists are always focused on marginal analysis, which means how much to produce one more bushel, right? Not in the aggregate, but what does it cost to produce one more? What's the benefit of producing one more? Okay, so here's some important websites that you can look up and learn on your own. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lecture and let you know once again, if you have any questions or concerns or want anything blown up in detail with a whiteboard and me drawing it out by hand, just please ask and I will provide it. Thank you very much.